let us continue now with the origins of Saint John. Now, John is the younger son of Zebedee and Salome. Some scholars believe that Salome was Mary's sister, and henceforth the disciples James and John would have been first cousins with Jesus. Now, John traditionally is considered to be the youngest of the 12 disciples, possibly in his early 20s or late teens. Due to the fact that John's Gospel says that he is known to the high priest, this would suggest that John and his brother James were Hebraic Jews. See, John's brother James is also called Jacobus in the Greek, suggesting that this is a Hebrew name. Now, some scholars think that John and James were both born in Bethsaida, as well as Andrew and Simon. However, John worked for his father Zebedee, and they seem to live there in Capernaum, so it's possible that John and them actually just grew up in Capernaum. Now, scholars believe that Zebedee was rather wealthy, and that he ran a much larger fishing network. This is based on the fact that he had at least 2 boats. One boat that he sailed, and one boat that was sailed by Simon Peter. And also, in John 18:15, it says that Zebedee's son, John, is known to the high priest, suggesting a high social status. Now, other things could suggest this is... Now, one other thing that could suggest this is the fact that John authors several New Testament books, showing that John was highly educated. Therefore, this meant that his family was wealthy enough in order to afford such an education. Also, in Matthew's Gospel, John's mother comes to Jesus, and she asks Jesus whether James and John can sit on his right and his left in the kingdom of God. Mark's Gospel actually has James and John asking this themselves, although Matthew's Gospel is the one that says that their mother asked on their behalf. And since the book of Acts shows that the disciples at this point in time still thought that Jesus was going to establish an earthly kingdom, this means that they were thinking that they could be set up as nobles in the earthly messianic Israelite kingdom. Now, the fact that James and John, or at least James and John's mother, would make such a request to Jesus would suggest that they already are familiar with having a high social status. This is something very important to consider, because you often hear people talk about how Jesus had simple, uneducated fishermen be his disciples. Now, this statement is somewhat incorrect. Now, the statement does hold true when we talk about guys like Andrew and Simon. They were employees of Zebedee. And in 1 Peter 5:12, it mentions that Simon Peter had a scribe write his epistle for him, demonstrating that Simon most likely couldn't read or write. Yet James and John were not simply uneducated fishermen. Since John could write so many books, it demonstrates that James and John were educated, that they were sons of a wealthy fisherman, and they were considered part of the upper class, being known to the high priest. It's possible that John was a disciple of John the Baptist before he became a disciple of Christ. This all depends on the identity of the unnamed disciple in John chapter 1. As I mentioned in the Origins video on Andrew and an unnamed disciple were followers of John the Baptist before they became followers of Jesus. The most likely candidate for this nameless disciple is John himself. The reason for this is that it's John's Gospel, and John has the habit of not using his own name in his Gospel, simply referring to himself as the beloved disciple. There is another alternative, and that is that the nameless disciple could have been someone like Philip, and this is due to the fact that Philip is from Bethsaida and could have been friends with Andrew and Simon. Secondly, since Andrew went and found Simon and said, "We have found the Messiah," it could make sense that Philip went and found Nathanael saying, "We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote." This could suggest that the nameless disciple is actually Philip and not John. This is possible, and there's the possibility that the unnamed disciple could have been somebody else, even James. However, most scholars seem to accept that John is the nameless disciple mentioned in John 1. And so it is possible that Jesus first called Andrew, Peter, Philip, Nathaniel, and James and John, being called later. However, like I said, the most likely interpretation of the text is that John is this unnamed disciple, and that Simon, Peter, Andrew, James, and John are all called together, first in the first chapter Gospel of John, and then later again in the callings mentioned in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark and the Gospel of Luke. So that wraps up the origins of the disciple John.